her latest book, it's there, and some of her books, El País de Uno, México, lo que todo ciudadano quisiera no saber de su patria, with Jorge Volpi and Gritos y Susurros and Experiencias Intempestivas de otras 39 mujeres, among others. She was an advisor to the Human Rights Commission of Mexico City and is a member of the citizens group Fiscalía que Sirva and Seguridad sin Guerra. In 2015, she was awarded the Legion of Honor by the French government in recognition of her work in defense of human rights and freedom of expression. Forbes named her one of the 50 most powerful women in Mexico. She continues to teach daily, including today, and I'm very glad she could join us to have a very interesting discussion on what's at stake in Mexico in the June election. So with that, please give Denise a warm welcome.
Thank you.
Here. I'm sorry. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak to the Georgetown community. My book is there, my most recent book, and I wrote it in less than 2 months, full of anxiety and determination and a great concern about the future of my country and the future of democracy. Oftentimes, Mexico is overlooked when we speak of democratic backsliding and democratic erosion throughout the world, a trend that many countries are undergoing. And Mexico has oftentimes eluded that classification of a country undergoing democratic erosion because many people believe that it is a progressive left-wing government that has helped the poor, that has quite nationalistic and so on. And I wrote the book precisely because what I have been analyzing and describing and been a participant of, at times involuntarily, is very different to the positive appraisal that Mexico oftentimes receives from the international press or from many of the people who support the government and contribute to President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's popularity. So I asked myself the question, I tried to respond to a question that I posed in an article in Foreign Affairs last year entitled, "Is Mexico's Democracy Dying?" And at that point I said, it isn't dying, but it is at risk. And that is a point I want to underscore today, and it is a serious risk that could be reinforced by the outcome of the 2024 election. And I was described here as an academic and a writer, but I want to emphasize the fact that I have been, throughout my life, an activist. And I'll begin this presentation with a personal anecdote, and by the way, the book is full of them because I've wanted to convey stories about what it has been to be either the target of democratic erosion, to be under threat by the president, to be named in the morning press conference, so that this isn't just an abstract academic discussion about backsliding, but I wanted to convey how I've lived it in carne propia. And I'll begin with a specific anecdote. About a year and a half ago, I went to the march, as I do every year, where we remember what happened in 1968. And for years I've been attending that march, and it seemed imperative to do so now more than ever because of an aspect that is oftentimes overlooked when people analyze Mexico today, which is the very rapid militarization of the country and how antithetical that is to democratic consolidation and the threats that that poses to the future. And because the spirit of 1968 was precisely more democracy, less militarization, I went to the march, and I marched with the people I usually march with, Article 19, Amnesty International, and with the mothers of the disappeared, with several women's collectives. And we were carrying a huge banner, 104 meters long, that it had the sentences written on it, stop impunity, stop militarization. And we started off in Tlatelolco and then marched to the Zócalo. And I was tweeting as I went there, as we walked. And when we got to the Zócalo and started to unfurl this huge banner and put it on the floor, in the main square of the Zócalo, I saw a group of young people, supporters of Morena, that approached in a very intimidatory fashion and started yelling, "Fuera Dresser, fuera Dresser," and they approached in an ever more menacing attitude and started yelling things like, "Representative of the oligarchy, you are vocera del neoliberalismo, spokeswoman for Carlos Salinas." And I was thinking, but I wrote an entire dissertation that was critical of the politicization of social programs under Carlos Salinas, and I've been a government critic now for over 30 years, and always trying to emphasize the same causes that have been or aspirations that have been unfulfilled in terms of respect for human rights, transparency, accountability, things that you are used to in the United States, but that Mexican democracy never fully acquired. And we've been through a long process of 30 years of trying to consolidate democracy after a transition to specifically electoral democracy in the 2000s. So I tried to confront these people and engage them in a debate. They wouldn't even let me speak. And then they started to become more violent. They were pushing me and yelling, encircling me and pulling my clothes. You can actually look at, in YouTube, there are videos about this. And the women who supported me, y que me acuerdaron, who took care of me, were the mothers of the disappeared. And at one point they said, "Denise, we have to get you out of the Zócalo because this could become too dangerous and too violent." So we slowly left while they were yelling at us and pushing us. And a few blocks after we left the Zócalo, I started to cry. And not because I felt intimidated or because I'm a coward. I cried because of the paradox of the moment, where someone who has tried to be consistently democratic and left-wing and in favor of progressive causes is thrown out of a public space that has represented a place where so many democratic battles have taken place, where we marched against the fraud in 1988, and then we marched to have an independent electoral authority, and then we marched so that there would be a National Transparency Institute, and then we celebrated when both Democráticas finally got elected after the electoral reforms of 1994 and 1996. So the fact that I've been kicked out of a public space, and there's actually a chapter in my book called Lo Público es Nuestro, because I have sensed that many things that were public goods, have now been paradoxically privatized by a government that calls itself leftist. And the fact that the women who are the mothers of the disappeared had also been kicked out and discredited, as they have been by the president for 5 years in the morning press conference. He has refused to even meet with them. And if you follow Mexico closely, you'll know that López Obrador disparaged la Comisión de Búsqueda, an entity that he created to actually assist the mothers of the disappeared in finding either the remains or trying to find their loved ones. He forced her to resign, and now he's created an own index of the disappeared with fewer people on it because he didn't like the fact that there were so many disappeared in his term. So think of the paradoxical moment. And I also thought, well, but why were they attacking me? You know, I'm not Taylor Swift. I'm not that famous. And then I thought, well, but of course, the president has mentioned me 117 times in the morning press conference, and I only have counted this because I'm litigating against him, and I will end my talk describing why I'm doing so.
but it's become part of a pattern of governance on the part of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, where he basically governs through the morning press conference and creates existential enemies and polarizes and denies the legitimacy of the opposition and decries anyone who criticizes him, even if they're from the left or they accompanied him. Or even today, the New York Times published a long piece on possible drug money going into his campaign, and the first thing he did this morning was say that the New York Times was un pasquín inmundo, and he doxed Natalie Katroev, who is the New York Times correspondent. He revealed her personal phone number. The New York Times has already responded to this, by the way. So that combination led to what happened that day. And it underscored something that I have been arguing now for years. After having read so much of the literature on democratic backsliding and democratic erosion, my book actually contains an appendix of suggested readings, because Mexico oftentimes has been insular in terms of its analysis of itself and doesn't compare itself to other countries. But when I started reading this literature that talked about what's happening in the world, democratically elected leaders who, upon reaching office and with the legitimacy of the popular vote, then abuse or manipulate democratic institutions in order to weaken them or capture them or strangle them in budgetary terms, and basically eliminate checks and balances, concentrate power, and then reform, change the rules of the electoral game so that they don't lose power again. Adam Przeworski says that democracy is parties that lose elections. And leaders like López Obrador, and you could count many others, I mean, this is a year in which there are going to be elections in many parts of the world. And in many of these elections, people are going to be called to vote in favor of a system that actually takes away their rights. So I started checking the boxes of, for example, Ziblatt and Levitsky's How Democracies Die, and the things that you should be wary of or that constitute a red alert. And at first, I only checked a couple of boxes thinking, oh, you know, this seems like what López Obrador may be doing. Now I have checked off all the boxes. And it's part of a global pattern where you have executives, what do? They go against the judiciary. They go against electoral authorities. They undermine the media. They create existential enemies. They polarize. And they present themselves as the only legitimate voice of the people. And this is accompanied by what Anne Applebaum calls the seductive lure of authoritarianism. In my book, I talk about how in Mexico it's become almost impossible to talk to certain people who used to be my friends and my colleagues. How democratic erosion leads to the loss of friends and colleagues precisely because there are many who become seduced by, as I said, a very seductive narrative of the people, those who've never had true representation, who are finally getting a voice. And this is a government that has expanded social rights by through direct transferences of money to a whole swath of the population, pensions for the elderly, scholarships for the young, all sorts of social programs that if you have lived in the margins and belong to the permanent underclass of Mexicans who live below the poverty line, receiving 2,000 or 3,000 pesos a month is a big difference to your life. So his popularity derives from that, and the fact that for many years, our transition to democracy was purely electoral. Well, not purely, but largely electoral. It did mean that there was alternancia, that you could actually vote for other parties, but it didn't, and that certain checks and balances were created, the regulatory apparatus of the state and the independence of the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Institute and the National Transparency Institute that made a difference, but not enough in terms of the lives of ordinary people. And in the absence of the state, a state that has for years been dysfunctional, and a state that, I mean, in many ways, López Obrador's diagnosis of what was happening in Mexico was correct. He said, this is a very elitist democracy, it's an oligarchic economic system, it's a rentier system, there's crony capitalism, institutions are often captured by elites, and he mounted the wave of populist authoritarians, either from the left or from the right, that use this same sort of discourse and capitalize on frustration with the democratic process that in many ways was incomplete. It was not representative. Institutions did not fulfill their roles. And what he offers now is real democracy, real representation of the people. And he's very ably used the morning press conference to create this sense of the people versus the elites, the people versus the oligarchs, the people versus that farcical democracy that the oligarchy controlled. And his popularity derives from that, the fact that he's also extremely charismatic, and then this repetitive morning press conference, which has become an instrument for governance, but has also been accompanied by a series of reforms, many of them deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, that have tried to, as I said, centralize power in his office, undermine checks and balances, go after or try and discredit the Supreme Court, try and discredit the National Electoral Institute. And for the members of my generation who actually fought for the democracy that we created in 2000, there's been an awful sense of déjà vu, of I've lived through this before, I've seen this before. Because the regime that he has in mind is very similar to the dominant party system that the PRI created and that we dislodged through popular mobilizations from below and then a voted transition and a series of reforms throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. So I argue in the book that Mexican democracy is being dismantled through what seem like democratic means, and with popular mobilization and legitimacy that supports that narrative. And I think evidence of that is what I've described that has happened throughout the course of his term. But what is different about this democratic erosion in terms of how you can compare it to the past is that there's a new ingredient, which is probably going to be López Obrador's most lasting, most enduring, and most toxic legacy, aside from polarization, which is militarization. The PRI had never relied on the armed forces. In contrast with the rest of Latin America, Mexico had managed to escape military coups because one of the, not that I'm a fan of the PRI, I never have been. It's a badge of honor to have been critical of the PRI for so many years because its legacy is embedded clearly in the DNA of López Obrador and many of his followers. But the PRI created a very small military that was always under civilian control, and that basically was there for natural disasters, public emergencies, but little else. And one may ask, well, why did he do this when one of his campaign promises, and it's the reason why I actually voted for him, because he stated clearly, I will return the military to the barracks in 2 months. And for those of us who'd been marching for 2 sexenios against Calderón and against Peña Nieto, this was finally the realization that someone understood the negative consequences of giving the military so much power. But he reversed that decision, and since the beginning of his term, he has given more money, more power, more responsibilities to the military than any Mexican president since the Mexican Revolution. One of the citizens collectives I belong to, Seguridad Sin Guerra, we have produced something called el Índice Nacional de lo Militarizado, that has developed a list of everything that used to be in the hands of civilians that is now in hands of the military. So it's airspace, it's airports, it's customs, it's immigration policy, now it's highway maintenance, and on and on and on. And this has meant dismantling a big part of the civilian bureaucracy, that you could criticize it endlessly, but you have fired these people, replaced them with members of the military that operate without any sort of oversight, with no civilian oversight, no accountability, and that are essentially transforming themselves into a poder fáctico, kind of a parallel government that has become a pillar of what AMLO calls the fourth transformation. I think there are several reasons behind this. One is AMLO did not trust the bureaucracy, and he wanted to create a force that was loyal to him. He also, I think, did not want a Lula-style scenario or some other scenario that he envisioned where there would be a military coup against him. So he applied this logic of better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out instead of outside the tent pissing in. And also because he wanted things to be accomplished very quickly. And in Mexico, if you try to build a train or create a refinery or build an airport to your liking, there's a whole set of administrative and regulatory practices that you have to abide to. But by reclassifying much of what the military was doing as of national security, he could jump over those requirements and then also classify these works in such a way that they were no longer subjected to the national transparency law. So think about the implications for the future. This is a military that, the argument, and this is a popular argument, better the military than the corrupt police. We have no other choice because we only have corrupt police. And the president has stated over and over again that the military is el pueblo uniformado. So they're on the side of the good guys. But think about the reality on the ground. This is a military that is not necessarily involved in combating public insecurity because the numbers remain stubbornly the same. What it does do is it builds. It now has businesses like the extinct Mexicana de Aviación, which is now a military airline subsidized entirely by the government, and can show off the fact that on a recent flight there was one passenger, but the Mexican taxpayer is subsidizing this military airline. In terms of key areas of governance and administration, we are now beginning to resemble countries like Yemen or Saudi Arabia. Not any democracy that one would like to, hello, to be associated with or classified with. So the long-term impact of militarization, as you know, for the comparatives here, is completely antithetical to democracy. Yet it is a popular move, as many of the things that the president does. And I have one great regret as a member of the generation of the democratic transition, and that is that we did not do enough to teach people about what democracy means, and why it's important to have division of powers, and why accountability is necessary, and why democracy is not just the will of the majority, because this has been the argument over and over again. we represent the majority, and that because the people are with us, we can approve unconstitutional laws, we can call for a dismantling of the electoral institutions, we can change the laws, the electoral laws, so that the playing field is no longer level. And this has been happening now for 5 years. And the president hand-selected through, we call it, I think it's Carlos Bravo Regidor, baptized Claudia Sheinbaum's selection as el dedazo plebiscitario, which was, you know, hand-picked, but with a veneer of plebiscitarian support. Hand-picked his successor. And he has said that he chose her because of her loyalty, and she has said that she will represent continuity with some change. And that allows for enough ambiguity for those who are disappointed with the fourth transformation to be able to say, oh no, but Claudia Sheinbaum will come here and correct the damage. She's rational, she's a scientist, she will make public policy decisions on the basis of evidence and not on the basis of whims or wills or the force of the will of the president. However, to go against the argument of those who still believe that, of the naive and I'd say the incredulous, several weeks ago, in order to insert himself in the middle of a presidential campaign, which he cannot do by law, but avoid that constraint, AMLO presented 20 reforms that he says will truly consolidate his fourth transformation. And some of them are things that are like motherhood and apple pie, such as, you know, defending the rights of animals or the rights of the indigenous population. But some of them, if Morena were to have a constitutional majority at the end of the election, would mean the end of Mexican democracy as we have known it. And I mean the end of something that is imperfect, needed a lot of work, malfunctioned for many, but consider the alternatives. My book is not a defense of the past. I actually argue that many of the mistakes committed by the governments of the transition, what they did or failed to do, the continuation of crony capitalism, the continuation of corruption, the way in which the parties tried to control autonomous institutions, because all of them tried to do so, and the fact that huge disparities in income and concentration of wealth prevailed, that paved the way for someone like Andrés Manuel López Obrador to win the presidency. So I'm not arguing for return to the past or justifying it, on the contrary. But if you look at the 20 reforms, some of them entail things that as Democrats you would not vote for or allow in your own country. The election of members of the Supreme Court and all judges by the popular vote. Election of the counselors of the Electoral Institute by the popular vote. The dismantling of the regulatory apparatus of the state, which means the Competition Commission, the Telecommunications Commission, those institutions that we had created that were at times weak, captured, etc. But the few gains that we have seen in competition, the fact that Mexicans now pay less for their cellular phone service has to do with the fact that robust regulation was enacted in telecoms that forced Carlos Slim to compete. So when you look at those reforms, you think, well, who are the real beneficiaries of this? I mean, who are the people that are jumping for joy in the face of a reform that would dismantle the regulatory apparatus of the state? Of course, the Mexican oligarchs, the 14 multimillionaires whose fortunes increased during the pandemic because of the lack of regulation, that a president who wants to rewrite the rules of crony capitalism, but not on the basis of transparency, competition, competitiveness, but on the basis of discretionality. Going back to the old model, where the oligarchs went and knocked on the door of the National Palace and negotiated a public concession for themselves. He also wants to do away with the National Transparency Institute, saying that because one of the arguments behind the dismantling of the state has been, these things are too expensive, they don't work, let's devote our resources to the poor. When, if you look at the budget, what the Mexican state spends on the National Transparency Institute or the National Electoral Institute is a minute percentage in comparison to what has been spent to save Pemex or to build the Tren Maya. So what Democrat do you know would actually be able to convince people that it's a good thing to eliminate governmental transparency? And he's argued that INAI doesn't work because corruption has not ceased in Mexico, as if it were the job of the Transparency Institute to combat corruption when it's actually the job of the Attorney General that supposedly was going to be autonomous and has proven to be not autonomous. So combine all of this in the context of something that we didn't have in the previous regime, PRISTA regime, which is the penetration of electoral politics by organized crime and drug trafficking. And you get a toxic mix of cartels participating in elections, financing elections, or killing off candidates or supporting candidates that they are able to pact with. And for these reasons, I argue that Mexican democracy is at serious risk, because you cannot have democratic rule without checks and balances, without an autonomous Supreme Court, without institutions. What you do have is discretionary presidentialism. What you do have is dominant party rule. What you do have is an electoral system where the opposition can compete, but it can never win again. And it's not as if I'm making an argument in favor of the Mexican opposition. One of the reasons we are in this situation is precisely because we have such a bad opposition. An opposition that is linked to, decades of bad governance, decades of bad corruption, decades of, militarization began under Felipe Calderón, and an opposition that has not been able to construct an alternative that is not simply a return to the past, that many Mexicans don't want. So what I've been arguing for is, at the very least, let's not give them control of Congress. Vote for whoever you want, but do not vote for unified government. Because what happened in the 2018 election is something that Mexico had never seen since 1997, which was the return of unified government. And that reproduced the political and institutional conditions that make hyper-presidentialism live again in Mexico. And I'll end and open this up for questions and a conversation by explaining to you why I'm litigating against the president and why I have spent the past 5 years litigating on multiple fronts, which have never happened in my entire career, to protect myself from a government that is taking away my rights. And I'm litigating to defend my rights, but the rights of many others with a kind of umbrella effect. I'm litigating against the president because in one of those mornings when he mentioned me, he said, "And Denise Dresser is the agent of a foreign government," because my name appeared in a WikiLeaks cable, because I'd gone to a breakfast at the US Embassy and someone had transcribed my comments, which were the same that I'd said in public and had been published, and were not in any way different from my public persona back in 2006. But the mere fact that they were in a cable led him to make the argument that I'd been there as an informant and as a spy. And the president has a right to describe me in any way that he chooses to. He can say, as many do, even though it's false, panista, conservadora, fifí, mal cogida. I mean, just take a look at my Twitter feed and you'll see the narrative there. He does not have a right to defame me, nor does he have a right to defame other journalists or other activists or other human rights defenders or scientists or doctors or the existential enemies that he creates every morning because they are useful to his narrative of polarization. So I've been litigating in the Mexican court system now for almost a year, and 2 years, and I'm awaiting the response. And what I did was I presented an amparo. An amparo is a stay that Mexican citizens can use. It was created so that you can protect yourself from an abuse of power. And I believe that the Mexican president, using the bully pulpit to defame and to go after and discredit people who oppose him, people who are critics, people who have been consistently critical, is an abuse of power. And especially in a country where, as you know, being a journalist is extremely dangerous, perhaps not for me, but for many others who've gone to the morning press conference whose personal data was leaked 2 weeks ago. So when I began this litigation, I have two extraordinary young women lawyers from the Consejo Nacional de Litigio Estratégico. We thought, well, the probability that we win this case is very low, but let's try it. And I like to quote Ai Weiwei, who says that citizens should use the institutions of the state in order to figure out if they actually work for the citizen or not. And we thought, well, even if we lose this case, let there be a precedent. Let there be a note in the history books that says someone said no. Someone said this is wrong. Someone said stop. And someone said this is our imperfect, precarious, dysfunctional democracy, but because I helped to create it, it is my responsibility to help defend it. Thank you very much. So let's open it up. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for coming to see us today. My name is Andres. I'm from Mérida originally. I'm a graduate student here in the MSFS program. And something that I'm curious about is people, as you mentioned, the dedazo, it's coming back, it has come back. But when it was instituted by the PRI, it was very notorious that the successor became the ultimate leader, and the predecessor had no, there was no power behind the throne largely. It seems that AMLO would like to be the power behind the throne. Can he do that? Do you think that is going to be a feature of the new dedazo? And if so, what mechanisms is he going to use to specifically act as puppet master?
Right. The question in and of itself is very revelatory of the problems that Mexican democracy faces, because you're asking me to do political analysis by trying to insert myself in the head of the Mexican president, which is the way we did analysis back in the 1980s and 90s, where we had to do pinología. Now we do Palacio Nacionología, where the personal psychology, the temperament, what he's written, who he talks to, who his advisors are, instead of trying to analyze the institutional or partisan dynamics in the context of an election. And I think that is a very bad sign. But I can speculate with you. I have no idea what his intentions are. I can only, on the basis of the evidence, tell you what I believe, of the limited evidence I have. Before he leaves office, he announces 20 reforms. One of them, by the way, is universal reform, universal pensions, 100% of your salary when you retire. Which, who wouldn't want that? I don't think any country can guarantee that, given, and especially not the Mexican government, given its precarious fiscal state right now, but very popular. So he leaves these reforms saying they may not be passed by me, but I want her to pass them. One of them entails the reduction of the proportion of votes that you need for a recall election, from 40% of the electoral roll call to 30%. So what he's doing is he's sending Sheinbaum a message. If you ever deviate from these 20 reforms and the path that I've set forward for you, I'm going to mobilize my troops for a recall election. So he's already tying her hands with those reforms that she has publicly committed to and owned. And there's another way in which he's tied her hands, not only her hands, but the opposition hands as well. Even I mean, in the unlikely scenario that Xochitl Gálvez were to win and that AMLO would recognize the defeat of his party, which I find very unlikely, both women would arrive to the National Palace with not only their hands tied behind their backs, their hands chained behind their backs by the Mexican military that has now become a parallel force, un poder fáctico that operates on the basis of its own rules and has become a stakeholder in the status quo. And its loyalty is no longer to the Constitution, to the state, it's to this party that gave it things that it had never had. Power, the possibility of enriching itself, the possibility of doing business. One of the chapters in my book is called Di no a los nuevos saqueadores, y con los oligarcas ni a la esquina. And another chapter is called La militarización no es la solución. Because López Obrador was right in terms of his diagnosis of extraction of rents, of patrimonialism, of parties arriving to power and then using government as a forum for distribution of the spoils. But now you've added a new player into that mix, and it's the Mexican military. So they're not going to be neutral in this election. So whatever Claudia Sheinbaum may say, and she keeps insisting that she is a scientist, but there are photos of her in a hard hat celebrating the inauguration of the Dos Bocas refinery. And at no point has she said, or I doubt she ever would, reverse the president's energy reform or stop bailing out Pemex. So how do you reconcile her scientific training, allegedly focused on environmental studies, and the fact that she has applauded the return of petro-nationalism and many policies that actually go against trying to reduce climate change and confront solutions or develop solutions for clean energy, etc. So I've called her a calca, which is like a carbon copy or a facsimile. And I made the mistake in 2018 when I voted for López Obrador to believe that he had domesticated himself, that he had learned the lessons of his radicalization in 2006. He had surrounded himself with very professional, moderate people who vouched for him. And she's done the same. Juan Ramón de la Fuente and others who have decent reputations, doctors, etc. But I just don't believe that story anymore. What is it called? Fool you once, fool you twice. Because at the moment in which she said, I will make these 20 reforms that López Obrador has presented, I will make them my own. Well, I want to ask Juan Ramón de la Fuente if he's actually in favor of the ministers of the Supreme Court being elected through the popular vote, which in the current conditions would actually mean the morenización of the court. So the fact that she has surrounded herself by competent people means nothing in a presidentialist system where we saw a cabinet that appeared to be moderate become radicalized, and people who have degrees in law, like the Minister of the Interior, Luisa Maria Alcalde, masters in law from Berkeley, making a strong argument in favor of judges being elected by the popular vote.
Can we take two?
Yes, of course.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Flavio Cabrera, I'm a master's student in global human development. And thank you so much for speaking up in our country, in Mexico.
amidst these really polarizing times. I'm from the generation of 132. I'm from Jalisco.
I marched with you.
Thank you so much. And I'm also from Jalisco, so my congressman was eventually Pedro Kumamoto, so we walked with them.
I walked with him too.
All right, so there you go.
That's when the chapter is called No te vuelvas porrista y detecta la propaganda. It's directed towards people like him, people that we marched with.
Yes, we knock on the doors, we got the vote, and we made it. But nowadays it's a different story, I believe. But if you could walk me through right now, Claudia Sheinbaum, I'm not oblivious, she might be our next president. How have you seen, where have you seen that she has fallen short when managing our capital, Mexico City? Because I do believe you're a resident, you live there. Where has she fallen short? Human rights, the economy?
I've been a feminist for a long time. I was taught to be a feminist by Marta Lamas. And I have marched on March 8th for many years. This is the first time under the last 5 years where we have marched and we have been gassed. We have been encapsulated. The president has put huge steel walls to protect himself. When we're marching, he discredits the feminist movement and says that we are puppets of the right and that we're just marching to discredit him. And even Claudia Sheinbaum, in a very disputed or controversial interview with El PAÍS, said that feminism, no era lo suyo, that feminism had to be subsumed into the bigger cause of protecting the poor. When I actually think that the feminist movement has been the one true, real, and consistent opposition to López Obrador, and it's interesting to see feminism also decrying militarization. So I think her management of women's causes leaves much to be desired. Then second, and I don't think it's less important, when López Obrador fired Carla Quintana, the head of the Comisión Nacional de Búsqueda, and the first thing she did was send the database to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, because she knew that that database would be manipulated by the government. And the first time she realized that was the case was when she sat down with Claudia Sheinbaum and with her group of technocrats, who actually started reclassifying homicides as disappearances or reclassifying them in some other fashion, and did not accept Carla's classification or tried to fudge the numbers. And she was the first person to do that with her. And then that led to the president's opposition. And then the third issue, and people tend to forget this, but Mexico City was the city in which most Mexicans died during the pandemic. And it wasn't just because of the size. If you recall, there was a crucial month, the worst month of the pandemic, which was December, forget the year, where scientists were pushing Claudia Sheinbaum to declare semáforo rojo, which would have meant complete shutdown of the economy. And she refused to declare semáforo rojo because she didn't want to irritate a president who had minimized the pandemic, did not wear a mask, said that we should embrace each other, that this was like influenza. And remember Hugo López-Gatell, the Undersecretary of Health, who was el novio de Mexico back then, and people loved him. And he'd come out and just spout things that were just obviously not true and unscientific. So she kicked that deadline, and people died. And there was a lack of beds, of medical care. I remember buying a concentrador de oxígeno, not for myself, but I thought, what if one of my students gets sick? There are no concentradores de oxígeno, and I paid like 90,000 pesos for it when they cost a third of that. And then she did something even worse. She allowed her team to distribute kits of ivermectin, which, as you know, is not scientifically proven to be used for COVID. And she distributed these COVID kits to 281 kits to people without their consent. If any of you are familiar with health protocols instituted worldwide after Nuremberg, it is that you cannot, it's an ethical violation of a huge magnitude to experiment on people without their consent. In a normal democracy, Claudia Sheinbaum would not be a candidate, bueno, ni para the school board. But because we are not a functional democracy, this has been overlooked. So I'd say those 3 areas. I could go on, but I think that I don't have 5 hours here.
I think we can take 2 more very quickly. We'll take 3.
Hola, Francisco Javier, also from Jalisco. 2 quick questions. One about political violence, and what have you read about how political violence might or might not affect politicians de la oposición? We know that activists are targeted, but there are a lot of candidates nationwide in the last electoral cycle, this electoral cycle, that have been attacked, including assassinations. But have you seen maybe a pattern towards the victims being of the opposition, o sea, no morenistas? And then why is AMLO, what's your gut feeling for why AMLO is being quiet about around a lot of this violence? The other question is about the regionalism in electoral politics. As someone in Jalisco, I know there's a very dynamic multi-party system there where maybe the PRI doesn't look like the national PRI. Movimiento Naranja doesn't look like Movimiento Naranja nationally. Morena could also take its own regional flavor. I also walked with Mamoto, no comment, but I will say that I think that maybe it may take on a regional color because of the local actors. So what are your thoughts on that regional dynamic? Thank you.
Let's take 1 more. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
Hi, I'm Abril. I'm from Monterrey, and in Nuevo León we have it was similar to the regional question. We used to think that Movimiento Ciudadano was like the change that we needed, like the answer to all our problems. And recently, we're worried that it's just like an extension of Morena, or maybe like a hidden branch of Morena that can just be manipulated by AMLO. And I was wondering what you thought about that, if you think that's true, or if it's just rumors going around, or if we should be worried about, for example, voting them for Congress, if they are also part of Congress, will they count as like majority with Morena, because they often vote with them, and should we be worried about voting for them as well?
Regarding public insecurity, it's a topic that I'm not an expert on, and I've chosen not to be an expert on it because that's the kind of thing that does get you killed. And I have a training as a comparativist, but there are other people, Eduardo Guerrero, it used to be Alejandro Cope, what's his name, Ramon, the anthropologist. Anyway, there are people, and a woman at CIDE who's been doing analysis of mayoral candidates that get killed. I cannot discern a pattern of more opposition candidates or governing or presidentes municipales getting killed more than Morena candidates. I don't know if that will change. I don't do work on cartels and the intricate local politics of who they support and so on. I'd say the trend, however, is that cartels do inject money into campaigns. They do help choose candidates, they veto candidates, and they kill people who do not pact with them. And that's indistinct of party affiliation. And this is, I think, a trend that is increasing as time goes by. Because of the fragility of the Mexican state, there are many areas of the country, as you know, that are tierra de nadie, where cartels or criminal organizations govern. There's a study that just came out on the big business of avocado, the complicity of organized crime and the infiltration into what is the big business of growing avocados and lemons in Michoacan. And there are very specific, I'd say, state dynamics at play in this election. There's a national trend of Morena probably winning most of the governorships. If you look at the polls, the opposition, there is support in some states, like Coahuila will never, and not that it's up for Coahuila will never vote for Morena. It's unlikely that Guanajuato will ever vote Morena. I don't think Yucatan will ever vote Morena. And Jalisco is a toss-up. Jalisco, because the fact that Movimiento Ciudadano governed there, but then you get like personal dynamics, you get fights, infighting within Movimiento Ciudadano itself. So I'd say there's like the macro level analysis of the dominance of Morena, and then some specific states where you're going to see interesting contests that are based more on personalities and who the candidates are, more than the purple tide of Morena. Regarding Movimiento Ciudadano, I used to think that Movimiento Ciudadano was a really interesting progressive alternative, and that they were like this tiny archipelago of social democracy that, if they did things correctly, could grow into a national force. But what have we seen over the past month? La samuelización de Movimiento Ciudadano, which is basically because Samuel Garcia, during the 2 weeks that he was a presidential candidate, erupted on the scene and was a very provocative force and raised the level of vote intention for Movimiento Ciudadano. Once he got kicked out of the race, and you saw Maynes arrive and basically emulating the formula of the orange tennis shoes, the TikToks, the dancing, the drinking, and now, in I think a betrayal to the party's principles, the incorporation of candidates like Alejandra Barrales and Sandra Cuevas in their list of candidates, I think is going to put Movimiento Ciudadano's registry at play. They might not even survive a national contest. And I think that they have shot themselves in the foot in terms of appearing as a true progressive left-wing alternative. And I think the relationship between Samuel and Andrés Manuel López Obrador was one where one could believe that Morena was playing Movimiento Ciudadano to basically divide the opposition vote. And that's why I liked it when Luis Donaldo Colosio said, I will not be a candidate in this race because I do not want to divide the opposition. And as a comparativist, just to end, I was very interested in the electoral results in Poland because I've been there recently because I'm friends with Anne Applebaum. And Poland also experiencing severe democratic erosion. And the only way they managed to end this trend was through a coalition, a broad spectrum coalition that transcended ideological divides and that got a lot of young people voting. We're not there yet in Mexico. And that's why I am pessimistic in terms of the outcome of the vote, but hopeful that Mexicans have learned their lesson in terms of not promoting unified government. Because what we've seen historically is that unified government produces authoritarian rule and abuse of power, as we've seen repeatedly in many decisions over the past 5 years. Thank you very much for coming today.